Good evening. We're going to get started here in just a minute. If you want to, you can go ahead and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. I do want to mention one thing. I forgot to say it this morning to our church family. Priscilla Tenney's daughter Shelby had her baby at 5:17 this morning, and she had an 8-pound, 8-ounce little girl, Presley Ann. And Mom Shelby and baby Presley are doing really well. And so we want to celebrate this new life with this family and wish them a quick trip to the house and not having to stay in the hospital very long. Also, found out this morning as well that Harley Prater will be coming home this week from the Catherine's place. And so that's an answer to prayer as well. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and I'm going to read the first 11 or 12 verses here in the King James, and then I'm going to switch over to my New Living Translation for the remainder of the message tonight. Just for the practicality purposes of it, and you'll see what I'm talking about here once we get to it. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, it says, I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them of all kind of fruit. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, that of all sorts. So I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatsoever my eyes desired I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. I'm going to stop there at verse 11, and I want to go back to our outline now, and I want to just tell you kind of what we're looking at tonight. Life under the sun. What is happiness? Where do we find happiness at? And Solomon, on his endeavor, on his mission, went and tried all kind of things. And here in chapter 2, he gives us a detailed list of everything he tried in this world. And he came to a couple of conclusions that are very profound. I want us to kind of walk through this verse by verse tonight and just kind of glean a little bit from it. It is so practical to where we are at today in our world. And I really wish that all of the young people in America could hear a series of messages on the book of Ecclesiastes, just because of the wisdom that is there and the life lessons that they can learn real quick if they'll apply them and use them in their lives. And I want to start by asking this question: does having fun bring happiness? Does having fun bring happiness? And that's point number one. Does having fun bring happiness? Solomon says here, and I want you to look with me in verse number 1. I'm in my New Living Translation now. He said, I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. And he says, I'm going to try this first. I want to see if this will bring happiness. And so letter A there is, the preacher starts with entertainment. He starts with pleasure, things that the world says will bring joy. He says, I said to myself, I'll try having fun. I'll enjoy myself. And then he gets into this and he says at the end of this verse, but I found that this was useless, is what he says. It had no meaning, is what New Living Translation says. It was meaningless. I had all the fun I could possibly have. I enjoyed all the entertainment I could possibly enjoy. And I found out that this was absolutely useless, meaningless. And then he goes into verse 2, and he makes a statement here that I want you to hear. He says, so I said, laughter is silly. Laughter is silly. What good does it do to seek pleasure? He says, in essence here, he says, it's foolish to laugh all the time. It's foolish to think that life is just one big happy joke. It's just one big comedian festival. He says having fun gets nothing done. And he's talking about the practical things in life, the work that has to be done, daily living that has to take place. He says when you pursue entertainment, when you pursue personal pleasure, and we're going to get into some of these specifics that he gets into for this pleasure here in just a moment, the entertainment that he tries. But when you pursue all these things, he says it's meaningless. It doesn't have any value. And after you do it for a while, it becomes boring. It becomes it doesn't get any, it doesn't accomplish anything. And it leaves you feeling empty inside. This was the king of Israel who said this. Entertainment is useless. Then he says this in verse 3. After he tries the pleasure and he can't find any joy in that, listen to what he says in verse 3. After much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people find during their brief life in this world. He says, now I'm going to try the liquor business. In verse number 3. I decided to cheer myself up with wine, is what he said. And while he said that, he also said in the second part of that verse, while I did this, he shows his stupidity. He said, I still was pursuing wisdom while drinking. The problem was, he wasn't sober. He wouldn't be sober enough to understand the wisdom side of it because he was so caught up in the drinking side of it. And the pursuing of folly is what he said. He said, I wanted to enjoy myself. I wanted to sit around with people, good people, and for the few good days that we live, because a lot of people think today that the only good times that they're having is when they're drinking or when they're socially active or socially drinking. And he says, at the same time I was doing this, my mind was still trying to think wisely. But after all this was done, he goes into verse 4 and he lets us know that there was no happiness in the liquor business. So in verse 4, after he's tried the entertainment, after he's tried the liquor business, he sobers up, and after he sobers up, he tries something else. In verses 4 through 11, he said, if I also tried to find meaning by building huge homes for myself and by planting beautiful vineyards. I made gardens and parks, filling them with all kinds of fruit trees. Now listen to what he says. The question becomes, does hard work bring happiness? Does hard work bring happiness? Entertainment hasn't. So now the question is, does hard work bring happiness? Because men today, they try entertainment, they try work. When things get hectic, they put their minds, they involve themselves, they dive right into their work and let it consume them so that it can take away the hurts and the pains of this world. And they figure, well, if I can't do anything else and I can't be happy any way else, I'll at least make me some more money and that will make me happy. And so I'll work hard to do that. And here Solomon says, he asks the question, does hard work bring happiness? And here's what he said, I'm going to try it. So he goes into the construction business and the landscaping business. That's letter A. He tries construction and landscaping. Now keep in mind, he's pursuing happiness. He wants to know what happiness is. He tries having fun. He tries the pleasure. That doesn't work. He tries the drinking, and that doesn't work. And now he says, well, let me try hard work. Let me try the construction business. Let me try the landscaping business. And then we're told in verse 4, he builds all kind of things. First of all, he builds houses, is what we're told there. And that's number one there. He builds houses. And then he builds, he plants vineyards. And he tries that. And then it says he planted gardens there in verse number 5. In other words, he became an environmentalist and was trying to find happiness this way through all of his building adventures and his landscaping escapades. And then it says that he planted parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. He tried everything. He built anything you could possibly build. He planted everything you could possibly plant. In fact, he did it so much that in letter B we find out that he had a great agricultural program. Look with me in verse number 6. He said, I built reservoirs to collect the water to irrigate my many flourishing groves. He built pools of water. He pretty much built an aqueduct system so that he could take the water and send it off, irrigate it to his fields to take care of all the fruit trees and the different things that he had planted to make sure that the gardens were successful. He was a wise man. He built all of these things. He tried all of this stuff. He built and built and built and built till there was nothing else to build. And when he had finished building all of this, he gets to the end and it didn't bring him any happiness. And so then he tries something else. In verse number 7, it says there, I bought slaves, both men and women, and others were born into my household. I also owned large herds and flocks, more than any of the kings who had lived in Jerusalem before me. So now he says, well, I can't find happiness any other way. So he tries this. Verse 7, he tries human trafficking. Human trafficking. It says he bought slaves. He bought men's slaves. He bought women's slaves. He even had slaves that were born in his house. And he tried this to bring happiness and to bring joy to his life. And after trying this, and after trying the agricultural program, and after building and planting and construction and landscaping, and after the liquor, and after the entertainment and the pleasure, he got done with all of that. He still wasn't happy. And in the last part of verse number 7, he says that he adds to his inventory livestock. He tries livestock. And he thinks, well, this will bring me happy, so I'll try the whole farming industry. And it says he had large herds of cattle and large flocks of sheep. And in fact, it said he had more than any other king before them, anyone in Jerusalem. He had the largest farm, the largest flocks, the largest livestock inventory. And after all of that, it still wasn't enough for him. He still couldn't find happiness. So then, in verse number 8, he says this. It says, I collected great sums of silver and gold, the treasure of many kings and provinces. Notice, when all else failed, he tries the financial world. So I'll just try money. I'll make myself rich. Today we would refer to it as the stock market. He says, I've gathered silver and gold. I've built up my bank account. I've got treasures that belong to other kings, and I've incorporated it as part of my own assets now. And I've built myself this financial empire. And even in building this financial empire, it still wasn't enough. He still wasn't happy. He had tried money. He had tried farming. He had tried livestock. He had tried human trafficking. He had tried the liquor. He had tried the entertainment world. He had tried the hard work, the construction, the landscaping, the agricultural program, and he still couldn't find any happiness. And so he went on and tried something else. Here in verse number 8, the last part, he says, I hired wonderful singers, both men and women, and had many beautiful concubines. I had everything a man could desire. So I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me, and my wisdom never failed me. But listen to what he says here. Letter F. He tried the nightlife. He tried the nightlife. He tried the party scene. He tried the social club scene. He said, I had men singers, I had women singers, I had musical instruments, I had bands, I had women, I had concubines, I had wives. He said, I enjoyed all of the delicacies of that, the women, the sex, the music, the wine. And at the end of it, in verse number 9, he said, I'm the greatest there ever was in Jerusalem. He became famous in Jerusalem, greater than all that were before him through his wisdom, and he had no limits to what he was going to try to do to fulfill his desire. Look in verse number 10. He says, anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for all my labors. He said, I tried everything I could possibly try. I did everything I could do. I didn't withhold anything from myself. He said, I'm going to enjoy this. I'm going to enjoy it. And he did. He tried it all. And even after trying it all, even in this nightlife that he had, anything I saw I wanted, I got for myself. I was pleased with everything I did. This pleasure was the result, the reward for all of my hard work. And then after all of these things, he brings it to verse number 11. And I want you to look at verse number 11 with me. And here's what he said about all these things that he had tried. The nightlife, the women, the music, the band, the instruments, the finances, the construction business, the farming business, the livestock, the liquor, the entertainment, the pleasure, all of it. He comes to verse 11, he says this. But as I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. Listen to him. Can you sense the loss that he feels at the expenses that he's paid to try to discover happiness the way the world tells us that we're supposed to be happy, and how many people today are making a great livelihood out of some of these things. And yet Solomon says, I did all of that. I did that a long time ago, and it didn't leave me happy. It didn't make me completely satisfied. And when I got to the end of it and I looked at all of my work and all that I had, I realized it was meaningless. It had no value. It didn't give me purpose. It didn't make me happy. And then he goes into verse 12. And he says, suddenly I realized it was all a waste of time. A waste of time. But then look at verse 12. So I decided to compare wisdom with foolishness and madness. For who can do this better than I, the king? I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness, for the wise can see where they are going, but fools walk in the dark. Yet I saw that the wise and the foolish share the same fate. Verse 15. Both will die. So I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value of all my wisdom? This is all so meaningless. Here's what he says in verse number 12. He begins to weigh some options and he begins to look at life differently. Up till now, he has tried everything the world can possibly offer, and everything that the world tells us will make us happy today, and everything that the world tells us will make us successful today. Solomon has tried it. He gets to verse 11. He said, it's a waste of time. It's meaningless. It has no lasting value. It doesn't bring you complete happiness. He says, so I'm thinking about wisdom again. I'm thinking about wisdom and foolishness. And I'm comparing the two. I'm weighing some options now. And it says, it's as if he says, maybe wisdom is the answer to happiness. Point number 3. Maybe wisdom is the answer to happiness. So he begins to think on these terms. And as he thinks on these terms, we're told a few things that he comes that comes to his mind. The first thing that we find here is he begins to weigh the options. He's weighing his options. It's letter A, weighing his options. He's comparing foolishness to wisdom, light to darkness, right to wrong. What he's worked so hard for, and comparing it to where he's at now and what he thinks about life. And he goes on here and he tells us in verse number 13, I know wisdom is better than foolishness. He gets into verse 14 and he says, the wise can see where they are going, but fools walk in the dark. And I guess that, I guess being wise is better than being a fool, and walking in the light is better than walking in the dark. And most people just do things and then they suffer the consequences afterwards. You can sense, you can tell that boredom is setting in on him. He's bored with life. He don't know what else to try. There's nothing else to try. He says, but after all, what more can any king do? What more can any king do? I mean, after all, he can only do what some other king has already done. And so then he comes to this conclusion, letter B. Wisdom begins to trump foolishness. Wisdom begins to trump foolishness. Let me go back to verse 13. I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. Verse 14, a wise man sees where he is going. A foolish person is like someone walking around in the dark. And yet, when I thought about these two things, and I thought about being wise and the wisdom that I've acquired and the wisdom that I've learned, and all the wisdom that God has given me, and I compare that to the foolish living and what I tried to do before and where I tried to find happiness at, and when I put these two things together, something dawned on me, he said. And in verse 15, that something was this: both the wise man and the foolish man die. They suffer the same fate. And so if both of them are going to die, what difference does it make? What good is it if I'm a wise man or a foolish man? Because when they die, nobody remembers either one of them. Both of them are forgotten. Nobody will remember the wise man, just like nobody will remember the foolish man. They both die. And he says, as I thought about this, as I came to this conclusion, it bothered me. It bothered me. And so his conclusion about the wise and the foolish people living under the sun, we see this in verse 15. What happens to a foolish person will also happen to me. He said to himself in verse 15, listen to this, both will die, so I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value of all my wisdom? This is all so meaningless. Here's what he said. His conclusion was this in letter C. I said to myself, being wise is useless. I'm a wise man. I've acquired a lot of wisdom. I've tried it the way of folly, the way of the world. I've tried it the way of wisdom. And when I consider the way of wisdom, I'm perplexed, because the wise man suffers the same fate as the foolish man. We all are mortal. We're all going to face death. And we're all going to die and be forgotten. He said, and to me, this means life is useless. It's meaningless. And then in verse 16 he says, verse 16, for the wise and the foolish both die. The wise will not be remembered any longer than the fool in the days to come. Both will be forgotten. And then he comes to this place, people will not remember either one. And then it causes him to ask another question. Is there real happiness in life? Because, after all, he's tried everything under the sun. He's tried entertainment. He's tried pleasure. That's included the nightlife, the women, the sex, the music, the bands, the instruments, the agriculture, the landscaping, the building, the construction industry. He's tried the liquor. He's tried He's tried everything under the sun, and then he's returned and he said, well, maybe wisdom is the answer, and he gets to wisdom and he thinks about wisdom, and well, I'm not so sure wisdom's the answer because wisdom leaves you the same way that it leaves a fool. You're both going to die. So what's the point of life? What's the meaning in life? What's the purpose of life? What is this? And it causes us to ask the question, is there real happiness in life? And then in verse 17 it says, so I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun is so troubling. Everything is meaningless, like chasing the wind. Is there real happiness in life? Letter A. Horizontal living leads us to this conclusion. Solomon said, I hated life. I hated my life. Now, I'm sure we've all had days when we hated life. And we wish that the Lord had already come back. Solomon gets to this place, he said, I've tried everything. And as I think the way that humanity thinks, the world thinks, the ones that don't serve God, the ones that don't follow God, the ones that reject God, the ones that reject His words, when I think about life like that and I live life like they did, I'm left with this conclusion, looking horizontally and not considering God or any of His character or any of His word to be relevant to where I'm at today. When I look at it just from the world's standard, it leads me to one conclusion, and that conclusion is that I hated life. It left me with nothing. And when you hate life, you'll get to the point where you'll think life's not worth living. That's why we're seeing suicide rates go up now. Because everybody's trying it the way of the world. They're trying it with entertainment. They're trying it with pleasure. They're trying it with the nightlife. They're trying it with the alcohol. They're trying it with the building, with the money. They're trying it with the construction. They're trying it with the landscape. They're trying it with all of these things that the world says, if you do this, you'll be rich. If you do this, you'll have more. If you do this, you'll be happy. If you do this, you'll have a bigger house. If you do this, you can buy more things. And they're trying and they're trying and they're working and they're working and they're wore out and they're just exhausted. And at the end of the day, they say, you know what? I hate life. I'm tired of this. I'm done with this. I don't want it anymore. Solomon goes into verse 18. He says, I came to hate all my hard work here on the earth, for I must leave to others everything I have earned. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they will control everything I have gained by my skill and hard work under the sun. How meaningless. How meaningless. He said, it makes me sad to think that everything that I have worked for and everything that I have earned here on the earth under the sun is useless. It's like chasing the wind. I hated everything. Because all the knowledge that I've gained and all that I've acquired, I've got to leave it to somebody else. And the person that I leave it to, I don't know if they'll be wise with it or if they'll be foolish with it or if they will value it or if they will even care for it because they didn't have to work for it. They didn't have to earn it. It doesn't mean as much to them. And when I think about all that I've done and all the labor I've put in and all the hours I've spent and the hard work that I've put into this, it makes me sad to think that I'm going to leave it to somebody else when I die and they may not even care. And so, he goes on. And he says, this is useless. His mindset of living here on this earth, in verse number 20 says, so I became sad about all the hard work I've done here on the earth. His reflection causes him to go into deep depression. Look in verse 21. It says, verse 20, so I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work in this world. He became depressed. Verse 21, some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. They inherited it. They didn't work for it. It has value, but it's because of what other people put into it, not what they put into it. And Solomon says, when I think about this, it depresses me. A person can work hard his whole life. He can acquire wisdom and knowledge and skill, and then he'll die, and other people will come behind him and they'll take over the work. But it may not mean anything to them, and they may not grow the work. They'll enjoy the benefits of it. He says, this is unfair. This is useless. Why should I spend my life doing all this only to end up with nothing, in essence? And then in verse 22, well, let's go to verse 21. Some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. This too is meaningless. A great tragedy is what he calls it. Verse 22. So what do people get in this life